Jesus Christ, you don't know the rules?
I have an aneurysm, why don't you?
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex.
Everyone who's anyone knows the basic rules of surviving a slasher film, right? Never do drugs, never say, "I'll be right back," and of course, it goes without saying, never, ever have sex. These are things that we all know, but are there other things that could determine the likelihood of survival for yourself in a slasher film? Things like the decade that the movie takes place in, or even your gender. To answer this question, I studied 135 scenes of violence from 10 slasher films. In selecting these films, I wanted to choose 2 movies from 5 popular film franchises, 2 movies from each franchise, as well as 2 movies for each decade, the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, as well as the 2010s. The films that were selected were done so to be a representation of a larger whole. I didn't study Peeping Tom all the way to the new Child's Play movie and everything in between. Instead, I chose 5 different slasher film franchises, including Halloween, the Friday the 13th franchise, A Nightmare on Elm Street, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Scream. So representing Team Leatherface is 1974's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, as well as 2013's Texas Chainsaw 3D. Representing Team Michael Myers is, of course, John Carpenter's original 1978 film Halloween and the 2007 infinitely inferior Rob Zombie film Halloween. And representing Team Freddy Krueger is Wes Craven's 1986 film A Nightmare on Elm Street, as well as Wes Craven's 1994 film New Nightmare. And representing everyone's favorite hockey mask wearing zombie, I selected Friday the 13th Part 3 and the highly underrated 2007 reboot. Why did I choose Part 3, you might ask? Well, that's the first film that Jason Voorhees actually donned his very infamous hockey mask, so I am using that as the standard for this franchise. And last but certainly not least, representing Team Ghostface is again Wes Craven's 1996 film Scream and the 2011 sequel Scream 4. But this study is surrounding gender and violence, among other things, which we will get to eventually. So for the purposes of the study, we have to make clear what we are defining as not only gender, but violence as well. This study does primarily focus on cisgender representation in slasher films. Although the study wasn't limited to that, none of the movies that I watched included non-binary or transgender characters, at least as far as I'm aware. But to carry out the study, we also have to define what violence is, which for the purposes of this study, I defined as malicious physical contact from the antagonist to the protagonist of the story. Once they make contact and the character either gets away or is killed, the scene is deemed concluded. Other rules and classifications were also considered to further examine what was happening on screen. For example, another factor that was considered was whether the victim of violence was engaged in sexual activity prior to this act of violence towards them. That way we can finally confirm or deny that idea that Randy put so eloquently in Scream. And lastly, I wanted to see if our protagonists in these films could have done anything in the way of protecting themselves. Self-defense was characterized as whether or not the victim showed evidence of fighting back in an attempt to stop the aggressor. But the primary focus of this study is to see the roles that genders play in slasher films. So, by analyzing 135 instances of violence, we can now determine the exact amount that women were victims of this violence as opposed to men. And in studying these scenes, it was determined that women account for just over 53% of the victims of violence throughout slasher films, while the men only accounted for an estimated 46.7%. The Scream franchise was actually the one that portrayed violence towards women more frequently, whereas the Friday the 13th franchise did so more often towards men. And I also wanted to see how these scenes of violence developed over time. Did these movies get increasingly more violent, and did they show scenes of violence for longer durations? Well, the results show us that regardless if you are a man or a woman, if you are in a slasher film, the more recent the movie, the more likely you are to be a victim of violence. Furthermore, acts of violence towards males not only became more frequent as time went on, but the scenes of violence also became longer and longer. However, and I did find this interesting, when examining the scenes of violence towards women, in almost every case there were more so as compared to men. However, these scenes over time, the duration of these scenes actually got shorter and shorter. And this idea of the scenes of violence towards women lasting longer than the men isn't a surprising one, right? I mean, the phenomenon known as the final girl is a pretty common one. Director of 1980's Friday the 13th, Sean S. Cunningham defined the concept of the final girl in saying the following: "The final girl in these little morality tales is the person who has embodied the moral code that society thinks allows you to go forward in life." Meaning towards the climax of these films, you have the final girl who is going toe to toe with our killer a lot longer than their friends were able to last with them. But there was one more thing that I wanted to examine when looking at violence in slasher films. I wanted to know if the behavior that our protagonists engage in can perhaps determine their fate. And we've already discovered that women are more often victims of violence in slasher films than men, but do the women survive their encounters with violence more so than men? Well, in this study, it was determined that women were nearly 4 times as likely to survive their encounters with violence. So, sorry fellas, although you are less likely to become a victim of violence in these films, if it does happen to you, you're probably going to die. But there are other factors that could contribute to how likely you are to surviving a slasher film, right? Because I also studied how engaging in sexual activity could relate to the likelihood that your character in this film is going to die. And the data did include that if you are a character who engages in some form of sexual activity prior to their engagement with violence, they are 25.8% more likely to die than those who are good little boys and girls who keep it in their pants. Meaning that if you find yourself in a slasher film and you're too busy getting it on, you're probably only having a 12% chance of survival. So I hope it was worth it. In addition to sexual activity, I kind of wanted to study the opposite of that. I wanted to see if our characters could perhaps, instead of decrease, increase their chances of survival by perhaps defending themselves in some way. This is more than just the pretty standard kicking and screaming that you see in these kind of movies. I wanted to see if they made an actual conscious effort to save themselves. And according to my data, the victims who did attempt to defend themselves were 50% more likely to survive as opposed to those who did not. So if you do find yourself in a slasher film and you are having sex, at least try to defend yourself, because you will be far more likely to survive your brush with death. So in studying all these different things, I was able to conclude that there are varying degrees of discrimination against genders in slasher films. Women on one hand are far more likely to be victims but survive their encounter, whereas men are less likely to be victims but they will probably die. But why would we study this genre? Why does it even matter? Why is it more than just a hopefully pretty fun video for YouTube, right? I think through further examination of the genre, more information on the current perception of women in horror can be gathered in an effort to continually develop and evolve this genre. Cinema has the opportunity to be a tremendous tool. It can share perceptions and experiences from people across the globe. However, when analyzing the type of impact that media can have on one's perception, it's important to recognize the type of entertainment that we as fans are consuming. And from a creative standpoint, I think in analyzing the types of tropes that are portrayed in these movies, audiences who may become filmmakers could change and develop this genre to offer something new that challenges the status quo. In doing so, we could evolve the genre, perhaps bringing new and exciting ideas, and develop these films that so many people, myself included, are a really big fan of. So thank you guys so much for watching today's video. I put a lot of hard work into this and I hope it's something that you guys appreciated. I wanted to offer something a little bit different for the incoming Halloween season. So make sure you leave your thoughts and opinions down below. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching today. I hoped you liked today's video. And if you did, you can click on the link down below and subscribe to my channel to see more movie reviews and movie related things. You guys, thank you so much for watching and see you next time.